Welcome to the AI Chat podcast. Today on the podcast, we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Ellie Graeden, who is a trailblazing data scientist and innovative leader. She's currently serving as a partner and chief data scientist at Luminos Law, or I believe that begins next month, as well as a research professor at Georgetown University. She has over 18 years of experience. She's made significant contributions to data strategy, system designs, and also public health through her work with organizations like the CDC, FEMA, and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She's really renowned for her expertise in utilizing data visualization and computational modeling to inform policy decisions and enhancing global health security. We're super excited. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Jaden. Happy to be here.
Okay, so I want to just get right into this. For those that are listening, you have to know I literally sent her an email in September last year trying to get her on the show. We've been going back and forth for a while, and she's obviously super busy, but I'm super happy that we got you on. What I would love to kick this off with is asking if you can share a little bit about your journey, what led you to become a chief data scientist at Luminos Law and a professor at Georgetown. Give us a little bit of your background.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Yeah, happy to. So I came at this actually as a scientist. I have a PhD in biology from MIT. And what I really care about, though, is getting data used. I finished my doctorate in the years when biology really became a data field. We were just finishing the human genome sequencing project, and all of a sudden you went from dealing with an N of 6 to dealing with N's in the millions. And it fundamentally changed the field. But I saw a lot of those data not getting used. So I moved down to DC and started working at the policy interface, trying to figure out how to make data useful for policymakers, but for decision makers writ large. So they then launched my own company where we designed and built a whole lot of these systems. So figuring out what the data are, what the modeling is that is coming out of scientific communities, but figuring out how it needs to get used in a policy and governance environment for practical operational activities. So what actually needs to get done in the world. And that's really where my interest in data governance evolved, because we need data sharing as much as we need good data protection. And that's a dance. It's both a policy dance, but it's also good engineering practice. So my position at Georgetown has really been zooming in and focusing on those more academic, or those issues on a more academic side. And now at the law firm, I'll actually beginning to put them back into implementation, where all of a sudden we're in this world where there's a huge amount of data governance and policy being written. It's already been written, right? We're seeing copyright and libel laws. This isn't all new. It's not just based on the new AI legislation coming out of the EU. But we somehow need to be building engineering systems in ways that address those requirements and that meet the needs of the people using the products. So that's really where I'll be sitting.
So fascinating. Super interesting background, and I'm excited for what you're going to be moving into as well. One question I have, after kind of looking over a lot of what you've done, I've been super fascinated, and I'm wondering, how do you integrate your background in developmental cell biology with your work in data strategy and systems design? These feel like completely different things to me. I mean, I am no expert, but I'm just so curious.
Fair question. So I think of all of these as messy, complex systems. So what I always liked about biology is that, and there are a lot of biologists in my field who spent their entire career looking at a single protein or a single folding interaction. I wasn't that person. I was the person who went from genetics to protein and biochemical interactions, all the way up to cell shape change, all the way up to how do you actually build the brain over the course of time. And it's those sorts of large-scale systems integration problems that I've always been really interested in. They're complicated, and like I said, they're messy. So I always liked biology because you have to pull the data up and derive an understanding of the system from what already exists in the world, as opposed to systems engineers who, say, build an airplane, and you define every piece of spec from the top down, and then it's a matter of just simply meeting that spec. Biology is a messy system. I like that.
Okay. Super fascinating. The other thing I would love to ask you about is, what kind of inspired you to focus on data visualization and computational modeling? And then maybe especially in the context of policy and governance decisions. I know you've kind of worked there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I deeply believe in the power of data. I really am that nerd. And I think people make better decisions when they are given information in ways that are directly relevant to them. And that's actually about who that person is. It's about the decision they're trying to make. And I did a lot of work in emergency management where you're talking about people who need to make life and death decisions on the basis of huge amounts of computational modeling and quantitative data, but they're making those decisions in the course of 5 minutes. And you either give them data that are relevant to them and meaningful, or they're going to make that decision on the basis of whatever they have in front of them. And that was really where I got into data visualization, because it was a way to do that communication of highly complex data and outputs of computational modeling. The National Hurricane Center models are still written in Fortran, right? So this is, we're talking, yeah, absolutely. And you're talking about those models needing to get integrated into an Excel spreadsheet run by the Army Corps of Engineers that's calculating things like how many pallets of water need to get loaded on a C-17 in a distribution center in Texas. And so you have these funny translation problems, and they're all large-scale data integration problems at practice, but they're about a person who has a decision to make at the end of the day. And that's really where I've always sat, is figuring out how you do that translation effectively. So some of that is about, well, what data can you use in which contexts? The governance is incredibly important, and you can only use certain types of data in certain contexts. You need to be good stewards of it, because these are also, it's fundamentally data about people and about their experience in the world. But then you need to be able to use that information very, very rapidly. And so it's been a lot of analysis of all of those data and modeling systems and understanding how people make decisions on the basis of it. So I was actually just in Rome last week at the G7 as a delegate to the Global Partnership meeting, working on biosecurity issues and talking about how AI is going to transform the biosecurity space and the threat domain. That same type of thinking and that same sort of systems analysis applies in all of those different contexts.
That's amazing. So I'm wondering, right? So we have a lot of these exciting things you're working on, and you've, expressed a bunch of different, challenges that we were facing and that you've helped to solve. I'm wondering if you can discuss maybe a specific project. I don't know if I'm assuming you're starting at Luminos Law soon, or have you been working there already for a little while?
We're in the midst of the transition.
Okay.
So we must go to transit.
Okay, so it's probably more Georgetown than where this question would land, but I wonder if you can discuss maybe a specific project at Georgetown where AI or machine learning, significantly impacted the outcome of something you're studying or working on.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of really fun examples. So one is that we're building a large-scale knowledge graph and graph database to integrate data that looks at everything from spillover risk from zoonotic disease, so thinking about which animals, wildlife populations, get sick. When they get sick, and really can identify where they are, right? It turns out we don't do a lot of good public health on wildlife populations. So
Okay.
So this is actually dovetails with another project that we did where we actually just launched a big platform called Pharos, which is designed to actually upload and allow researchers to upload line listing data for wildlife disease. So if there's a researcher in Sao Paulo who heads out into a bat cave and takes a swab, they have someplace to put that information immediately and then get academic credit for it. But those types of data then feed into this large-scale graph database that we've built that is actually then mapping out, and that it's designed to link those types of data and modeling to human epidemiological modeling, pull in data on the immune characteristics of those people. What is their risk characteristic? Do they have HIV? Have they been vaccinated? Right, both sides of that. And then we're working with researchers at NORC who are running a survey that's asking about vaccine hesitancy, that then becomes a parameter for immune characteristics in those populations. So then you're looking at end-to-end global scale risk, that each one of those individual models they're all machine learning models, but they all need to integrate into a large scale meta model So that's the work that we're doing, is figuring out how you put all of those pieces together. In another quick example, we're working with LAPD to develop a model of interaction patterns between police and civilians to better understand what good communication and effective communication in policing looks like. And that's working with body-worn video data that we're getting from the department and running interaction models that look at both the video and the verbal communications between the officer and the civilian to evaluate what types of outcomes you get when you have more and less effective communication, and even what effective communication does in fact mean in that sort of context. So two very disparate examples, but both large-scale data integration problems across a lot of different fields where you're using really complex data and modeling to answer these sorts of integrative questions.
Okay, both of those are so fascinating to me. I want to dive into the health one, but just like out of curiosity, you mentioned the study that you're doing with police. Is that ongoing, or do you have any like takeaways, like what is considered good communication between police and civilians? Did you have any like interesting takeaways from that one in particular?
Yeah, great question. So we're very early in that process. We're just getting access to the body-worn video right now. So unfortunately, you're going to have to wait on the take-home messages there. I'm not sure yet. We're not sure. We'll figure it out.
Well, I'm excited to see what comes out of that, because that sounds super fascinating. One thing I'd love to ask about is, like kind of looking at your work with the CDC and FEMA, I'm wondering like, how do you see AI evolving in the field of emergency management and like public health?
Yeah, great question. I think the two big places that I see a lot of room for better integration of AI systems and modeling systems in general. One is using federated learning and methods to aggregate from what are really antiquated data systems scattered across jurisdictions all across the US, whether we're talking about county public health departments and or the hospitals that they're working very closely with. Those are really tough jurisdictional problems, because you're talking about public systems and private systems that need to integrate. People need to be making joint decisions on the basis of that information. And very often those databases weren't designed for supporting the type of real-time decision-making that we need to be making during emergency management. So a great example, during COVID, I was working with Nevada State a lot, and all of their vaccine data were originally designed to evaluate whether kindergartners had the vaccines they needed to enter school, right? And the challenge is, though, that meant that it was stored in a 2003 SQL database that was keyed on the individual. What that means in practice is that you can't get access to those data without getting all of the individual data or all of the identifiers with it. So I think actually a lot of the big steps forward won't be at the cutting edge of AI as much as they are in getting really good about tracking data provenance and data lineage through these systems, implementing privacy intensive technologies that are then focused on the outcomes that need to be driven in the world. I think we do a lot of thinking about whether these data or those data are HIPAA, need or require HIPAA compliance or COPPA compliance or FERPA compliance if we're talking about education type data. And we focus a lot on the individual data sets or the individual models. And I think in practice, what we're really going to be moving toward, and we're starting to see this in the governance space, is how do we think about how those models are being used? How do we think about the outcomes and the impacts? And so when we think about it from that perspective, and we think about those outcomes, we need patient level data, and we do need population data level data, and we need facilities level data. Who has power? Do they have quite literally, do you have power to the hospital, and do you need to evacuate those patients? Right there are a lot of data integration problems there that can be addressed by a lot of these new methods. That large scale analysis driven by AI models, for example, can be really powerful in meeting those requirements while retaining both the proprietary and the privacy components in the data that are feeding into the system.
Okay. So interesting. Looking at everything you've done, you kind of mentioned and talked to this a little bit of this at the beginning. But I'm wondering, with your experience in launching startups, you mentioned you'd done one. I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges, if this is applicable, that you might have faced in integrating AI technologies into that, and how did you overcome them? Assuming that you that was an element of what you were doing at the time?
What we've been doing is integrating data and modeling systems for over a decade. Those systems are not AI per se, or we certainly didn't call them that at the time, but it's all just evolution of the same models at scale. The biggest challenges are I really find the biggest challenges to be at the data level, really deeply understanding what your data are, where they come from, what training data you're using, whether you believe those data and modeling systems, and understanding and communicating to others the degree to which these are iterative processes. It's not just a single model. These are nested models. You run one set of models, you run one set of analysis that generates a series of outputs. You need to then track those through the system and through then subsequent levels of modeling that yield a broad range of outcomes. And again, I think this is where we get back to really thinking about what that use case is. I think the biggest challenge, whether you're in startups or in any other product system, is defining what the requirements are first and then deciding what the right modeling or analytical tools are to meet it and what data is the minimum set that you need to yield those outcomes. The tendency tends to be, well, I either really want this big fancy tool that I want to be able to say I'm using an AI model. I guess we'll figure out what we're going to do with it and what the product is after the fact. In which case, in a lot of cases now, all of a sudden we're discovering that we trained with data that we actually can't use for that particular outcome or that particular type of product. So I think a lot of this is in making sure that we go back to the basics of product development and say, well, what are we actually trying to build and what are we trying to accomplish first? And then aligning that with the AI systems that are going to be most effective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. 100%. I think that's the right direction that you've taken there. Something else I'd be curious to ask you about is, I know you've done some advisory roles with some big organizations, right? United Nations, World Health Organization. I'm wondering, like, in the context of those specifically, what are maybe some of the biggest misconceptions you've encountered around AI and global health security?
I would say around AI, there's a general assumption that the tool itself is singular, that it is a thing that has one set of specific outcomes or impacts. I think that's one gap in between sort of the technologists and the policymakers at that scale. I think the other piece is a problem from actually the technology perspective, which is assuming that if you have a tool, that it will be useful for any of these different outcomes, which is obviously not necessarily the case. Again, this gets back to, well, what are you actually trying to do in the world? And is that the right tool? But I think a lot of the other is not necessarily understanding where the hard step is. It turns out, especially when we're talking about things like biosecurity, but this applies in a lot of places, the hard step isn't the piece that's happening in computing. It's not the in silico half. It's the integration with robotics. It's the integration with physical infrastructure and physical systems. And what we dealt with a lot on the emergency management side was integration with utilities. These are the sorts of systems that are not even well datafied in a lot of ways. Those data aren't accessible, right? If you want to go in and figure out exactly who has electricity to which homes, when and where, those data aren't always necessarily readily available. If you don't even know where that is, then you can't just use a model to fix it. I think that's a lot of the challenge here, is really understanding where and how those AI tools fit in this broader real world context where you have a lot of systems that are not necessarily computing driven and may or may not be already integrated in a way that an AI model or any sort of AI platform will be applicable.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And definitely, yeah, it's interesting looking at the way people view these things. I'm wondering, you're moving into kind of this new phase at Luminos Law. I'm wondering, how do you kind of envision AI transforming the legal practice and also like policy development, maybe at Luminos Law or other places over, like, let's say the next 5 years?
Great question. I think the really exciting piece to me is that I think we're going to see a lot of specialization. We're going to start seeing AI models that solve individual specific problems. And in each one of those cases, there are a lot of regulatory constraints that are being placed, but also a lot of regulatory constraints that simply already exist. We know that we have this really powerful tool that can go have really large impact. How are we going to build governance systems within our organizations that mean that we can very firmly assert that we know what our model is, we know where it came from, we know what data it's holding, and we feel confident in how it's going to have impact? How do we know it's going to get used? How do we feel comfortable with its use? And how do we make sure that we're not putting ourselves at legal liability by implementing or using them? And that's where a lot of good AI governance process is going to make a massive difference. And that's what I'm excited about at the firm, is that we're uniquely positioned to integrate this conversation between what's happening on the legal side, which is typically in-house counsel who talks to a product lead, and it may or may not trickle down to the engineering team as specification, and vice versa. The engineering team may say, oh, but I could implement these engineering methods, but that may or may not be well understood by in-house counsel. And so we can go in and actually really effectively translate and help have that conversation around how you can build engineering tools that meet the requirements that are being placed by the legal domain, but also use that as a way not just to reduce risk, but to actually generate more value. I think there's a lot of skepticism that's coming in from the public now, where over the course of the next 5 years, that ability to say, no, I know what this model is. Let me show you. It's been validated. It's been bias tested. We really know how it's acting, and it is reliable and predictable. I think that's going to end up being really important. That's about good governance practice that percolates not just from your legal shop in-house, but all the way through your engineering process and really gets baked in as a value proposition.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's so exciting to see how that field is going to evolve and some of the changes that we're seeing there. I do think you guys are uniquely positioned, so I think that's going to be really interesting. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are some of the most pressing, perhaps ethical considerations in AI development for public policy and governance that we should be thinking about?
I think some of the biggest challenges are in the actual implementation. When we look at even the NIST framework for AI and addressing risk, there's a big gap between what the guidance is and how you actually implement that in engineering practice. So I think there's a big space and a lot of room to move in terms of translating what those specifications are and how to actually build a system that meets those requirements. But I think the other one of the really big issues in responsible AI is going to be defining what bias means, what good enough means, what actually is our goal or our end goal. It's very easy to say, well, you need an unbiased system, but defining whether that means that it needs to be as biased as the world already is. Does it need to be better than that? How do we define better? Who gets to define what better means? Because what bias looks like to you or to me may be different for someone else. And defining what those thresholds are and actually turning that into something that you can measure and assess progress toward is not necessarily an engineering decision. I mean, these are, in essence, values and judgment calls that need to be implemented in policy. And that's going to mean getting really precise about what we want the world to look like and therefore what we're comfortable with these systems doing.
Yeah, I think that's so important. It's so fascinating looking at, like you mentioned, these are values and judgment calls. And yeah, you're right. It's not necessarily an engineering decision, but it's a decision that I think the world is collectively discussing and trying to find what they think would be best. What I would love to ask you about is, it's been phenomenal having you on here. If people are interested in getting in contact with you or finding out what you're working on next, what's the best way for people to do that?
The easiest way to get me is through the law firm. So it's luminos.law. And I'm certainly on LinkedIn, and I'm also available through the Georgetown website. I'm at the Massive Data Institute and the Center for Global Health Science and Security. So I'm pretty easy to find online. And Luminos is certainly the place to come for all of the AI work.
Wonderful. Well, Ellie, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to any of the listeners, to the law firm, if they're interested in finding out more about what you're working on or getting in contact with you. To the listener, thank you so much for tuning in to the AI Chat podcast. And make sure to rate us wherever you get your podcast. And I hope that you have an amazing rest of your day.